And so we're going to go towards a conversation between Bas Jacobs and Matteo. Matteo, can you give us some introduction perhaps?
Yes, last week on a much less sunny day, I had a discussion right here with Bas Jacobs. I got completely drenched on the way here. And we talked about the economy, the post-corona economy, the consequences of the corona crisis on the economy, and the relationship between the different member states of the EU, especially when it comes to financing this economy and the level, and for instance, things such as the acceptable level of debt. Why, Italy can spend less than the Netherlands? Why should Dutch families pay for Italian debt? So very
interesting.
Very
also,
interesting.
Yes.
Probably not a Saturday afternoon topic, but it was a very good conversation. So please enjoy, and we can talk about it later.
Nice.
All right.
Great.
Excellent.
Okay, so hello and welcome. Today we are here for a conversation about the Dutch economy in this time of Corona, also in view of the European wider economy. My name is Matteo Millone. I'm a Volt member. I also used to be an assistant professor in finance. Now I work for the Dutch Central Bank. And that's why I need to say that all the views now are my own only and do not represent in any way those of the Dutch Central Bank. And I welcome Bas Jacobs, who's a professor of public finance at Erasmus University. Thank you very much for joining us. Maybe you want to give us
to be here.
Quick summary of what your research is about, what your expertise is.
Okay. My academic expertise is mainly centering on welfare economics, in particular optimal taxation. So I ask questions like how should redistributive tax systems be organized? How progressive should the tax system be? Should we tax capital income or wealth? How should we set commodity taxes? These kind of things. Also, I have studied education policies, education financing systems, and more recently I'm also doing a bit of macroeconomics. Things like how should government stabilize the business cycle when there is a downturn in the economy. So these questions all have in common that I want to understand how governments should do policy and what is the best way to conduct economic policies given the objectives of the government. So as an economist, I'm asking the question, what is the most efficient way to reach a certain government objective? And I study models, I try to do this with simulations, sometimes a bit of empirics, but that's my academic work.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and that's why we have you here, and I think your academic work is important in any time, in any circumstance, but right now is going to be even more important, especially now we're fully in the midst of the corona crisis. Most businesses are closed, most industries are closed, schools might reopen soon, right? But here we're expecting a significant hit to the economy. The IMF is expecting minus 7.5, for Italy is minus 9%. I'm Italian, that's why I mentioned this. So what we know is that there's going to be an intervention. There needs to be a government intervention to get out of this crisis. I think no one of any connotation, political or academic, debates that. The question is, how big is it? And should we be scared of the debt that is going to be one of the results of government intervention?
Okay, the last question I can be very short. We can deliberate extensively about it, but I think this moment is not the time to worry about government debt. I think it would be a capital mistake that we return to austerity policies the moment this crisis is declared over, because I think this is the wrong order. I think government debts are now high because of good things. First, there's this massive healthcare crisis that needs to be funded. Second, the government needs to do automatic stabilization because the economy is shrinking now, tax revenues decline, expenditures on unemployment benefits and social assistance benefits rise. So the government needs to, or will stabilize the economy. Moreover, the government needs to provide liquidity to firms in lockdown sectors. They lose all turnover, while their costs, wages, for rent will continue. And this means that without any liquidity support, without any short-term funding, these firms will go bankrupt and will be lost forever. And this will create massive scars, massive damages to the long-term supply of our economies. And this would create a very nasty, you can say, shadow over from the crisis into the future if we don't manage this correctly. So the government needs to increase government debt to provide this liquidity support, also to provide disaster insurance. We have a disaster. People lose their incomes without bearing any responsibility. It's not their fault that this crisis is around. So we need to also insure people against loss of income. So we need to finance the healthcare system. We need to do the automatic stabilization so as to fight the recession that will result. We need to provide liquidity support, and we need to have disaster insurance, and this will all contribute to the government deficit and the government debt. And this is actually a good thing. Government debt should be used to smooth these disaster shock over time, to dampen the economic fallout that we're currently facing, to distribute the burden fairly across these generations. And also, if you're a real economist, to smooth out the tax burden. Because if we would now suddenly start raising taxes, that would be also unwise policy.
Yeah. So you think that after this large amount of spending, then also taxation needs to be phased out in a way, or phased in a gradual way?
Depends on what you view as the optimal level of the government debt. Now, for the Netherlands, I think that the debt we had before the corona crisis was below 50% of GDP, might have been actually too low. We are currently still facing negative interest rates. The 10-year interest rate on government bonds is about 0.3%, minus 0.3%. So that means that people in the bond market are willing to pay the Dutch government money to borrow more. I think there's long-term trends that have to do with secular stagnation that lead to basically a big supply of savings in world capital markets, and basically not enough demand from investors, from businesses, to soak up this supply of savings, so these interest rates are very low. Now, with the crisis, savings will also increase. People become precautionary. People also cannot buy stuff in sectors that are locked down. You cannot go to the restaurant or to the hairdresser, so the money remains in your bank account. And at the same time, we see also firm investment collapse. So I think that looking at the world going into a recession, that interest rates will, for at least the short term, remain very low. And it's very easy for governments now to borrow more money.
And for you, you're meaning both short-term interest rate, which of course are the domain of the ECB, and long-term interest rate as well.
So when I talk about the 10-year, the interest rates on government bonds, that is like pretty long-term, right?
Exactly.
I think also short-term interest rates will remain low, what the central bank does in the short to medium term, say up till 5 years from now. I think this crisis will have a long shadow as of today. So the critical question for me is how we weather this crisis. So how large the production capacity of our economies remains in place. So if we succeed in keeping the damage to our economies low, then the supply remains intact, and that means that we have pretty much, if we are able to weather this crisis without much damage to the supply side of our economies, we are very well able to service a higher government debt. Moreover, with high supply and low demand in the economy, interest rates remain low. So also for that reason, we like to we try to repair these or prevent these supply shortfalls. However, if we badly manage this economy from a macro perspective, we let many businesses go bankrupt, many people become unemployed, and a lot of knowledge inside firms and inside people goes up in smoke. A lot of technology disappears. A lot of productivity in short term becomes lost during this crisis. Then I see that there is a probability that interest rates might rise.
Yeah.
Because if then the supply to our economies gets damaged so much, and as the coronavirus fades and people start to spend more and go out, but then there's no more firms producing all the goods and services that they want, then we get rising interest rates, wages and inflation. Maybe we re-enter normal economic times again. We get out of the liquidity trap type of situations. Yeah. Central banks can normalize interest rates, but that would be a very nasty, you can say, positive side to a very nasty situation where we destroyed a lot of our output.
Yeah. So let's say there is one scenario, like a more positive scenario, in which this is only a demand shock. People can't spend, but once the economy is open again, people can spend again. There's enough supply. The firms haven't closed down, so prices don't go up. The other scenario you mentioned, supply chains get broken, firms cannot produce, there's a lot of demand, this pushes prices up. At that point, central bank, if they see too much inflation, might need to raise interest rate, and then it's then when the debt becomes a problem.
Then it might become a problem, yes.
Exactly. So this is understandable from a Dutch perspective. Like public debt was 50% of GDP, below the 60% magical number.
Below the 60% completely arbitrary number.
Exactly, that's why I say magical with a smirk, because it's a little arbitrary, sure. But then we have, so the Netherlands should spend, but then we have countries like Italy, right? So that has 150% debt to GDP ratio, who should also spend. And it's also in the same market as the Dutch market, but probably cannot spend to the same extent. What do you think the solution, not the solution, but what do you see the problems there are?
Oh, okay, I think on multiple layers, the Italian case is, you could say, more troubling. First of all, I think that the health crisis is much worse in Italy than in, say, Northern Europe in general, because of the you can say the hospitals, the healthcare system is less able to cope with the corona crisis, and also maybe more people get ill due to the demographic structure of the Italian society. So I think, and this is also what I think led the government to pursue much more strict lockdown measures. Because if the healthcare system cannot deal with more patients, you try to prevent this overflow of the healthcare system by being more strict in social distancing, in locking down sectors to prevent this overflow of the healthcare system. So you can say more problems in the healthcare system, it's not bad, but a different demographic of the Italian population. Led, I guess, the government also to become much more strict and harsh in terms of lockdown measures, and this in turn has much more adverse consequences for the economy than in countries that are more lenient with these lockdown measures. So the economic fallout will, apart from the health crisis, the economic crisis will also be bigger and deeper. And you mentioned the numbers for the Italian growth rates; they're a bit lower even than the Netherlands, but it might also take a bit longer if the economy remains locked down more severely and for a longer period. Now, so this means also that the health of the public finances is deteriorating faster. It started out already from an initial position that was worse, and it will deteriorate faster. Moreover, the health of the financial system is worse, because banks still have relatively large amounts of non-performing loans, the legacy problems from the Euro crisis, and this means that the Italian financial sector cannot cope as well with the economic fallout as in Northern Europe. So it's, you could say, 4 crises. Healthcare crisis, an economic crisis, public finance crisis, and a financial crisis that might all impact the Italian situation in a much worse way than in Northern Europe. So I'm less sanguine, less positive about the Italian situation, to be sure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I see the same forces playing in Italy as we see in the world, namely a large demand for retirement savings. Due to the aging population, people want to hold large amounts of secure debt. That is Italian government bonds. I also know that in Italy, a large fraction of government debt is held by the Italians itself. So unlike many countries that got into problems in the Euro crisis, Italy is less of an issue because you don't rely so much on foreign borrowers that might withdraw once they think the situation is getting financially out of hand. If you rely on your domestic borrowers, then you are not confronted with sudden stops in capital flows, that foreign investors are not willing to provide you with any financing anymore. So you're more able to roll over your debts. Furthermore, I think, and this is also not something that's good, but it prevents meltdowns, there's a much tighter link between the financial system and the government, because the financial system owns the government debt, and the government has to rescue the financial system when things go wrong. So we call this the doom loop, or the deadly embrace between governments and banks is worse. But this also means that before you start considering even debt restructuring or something like that, you probably scratch your head. And that's what always has been the case so far in Italy. I think they will go at great lengths preventing any type of default. And finally, the European Central Bank has said, well, whenever a country gets into trouble with a run on the bond markets, it will do whatever it takes. Mario Draghi, July 26, 2012. So when Italy is really in dire straits and there's panic on the bond markets, it can get support from the ECB. Yeah. It will get support from the ECB if it's willing to subject itself to the program of the rescue funds.
But the message from the ECB has gotten a little more muddied lately. Like Christine Lagarde, the first pretty much press conference she had during the Corona crisis, she said that the only job was to keep inflation low and did not offer the same kind of certainty to financial markets that Mario Draghi did when he said,
I think she did try to do the Mario Draghi trick, we do whatever it takes, but the problem is that we don't face a liquidity crisis on bond markets. So what Mario Draghi did was to have a short circuit breaker on the bond markets, the lender of last resort, as we economists call it, that wasn't present. Every country with its own central bank has a lender of last resort to the government, that the central bank can always print enough money to service the government debt and the interest rate. And interest on government debt. So every central country with its own central bank has this, but in the European Union or in the Eurozone, we realized we didn't have it, and this created panic on the bond markets, and Mario Draghi stopped that panic. But the Corona crisis is a different type of crisis. It's not a liquidity crisis on bond markets. So you can say, as a central bank, will do whatever it takes, but you cannot solve the illness as a central bank. You can not solve the economic fallout as a result of the lockdown measures. You can soften or cushion it, but I think at this very moment, the central banks are largely out of fire with their monetary policies. What they now can do is provide sufficient liquidity, and that's actually what they're doing, to act as in their roles, the lender of last resort to the financial system. But I think now the game in town is fiscal, not monetary, to fight the backlash of the Corona crisis on the real economy. So I'm afraid that the messaging of Lagarde was a bit overstretched. Yeah.
So if the central bank is going to buy any government debt for the foreseeable future, right? So then high levels of debt shouldn't be such an issue anymore.
Yeah, and that's what you see in the financial markets. Even Italy, I checked last week, had an interest rate of 1.7% for 10-year government bonds. So Italy can pretty much roll over any additional, any debt it currently has, and it even can raise additional funds from the bond markets.
Yeah, so maybe, to sum up, the problem with the debt might not be its total size, but the cost of servicing it, meaning the cost of paying the interest rate on the debt that needs to be raised. So that's why the proposal to fund the recovery fund for the corona crisis was to issue corona bonds, or a version of the euro bond. So the idea is that if all the countries together will issue bonds and will go on the market and they would all be liable for the debt, then the cost of servicing this debt will be lower. This caused a political storm in Europe. Wopke Hoekstra, the finance minister of the Netherlands, was very vocal against it.
I felt embarrassed by Hoekstra, by the way.
Could you? Okay, so then I would explain Hoekstra's stance. So you don't have. Hoekstra said, "Well, why should we pay for countries that have been not being careful with their finances? This will increase the cost of our debt." What do you think of this stance? Does it make sense economically? Also, given the fact that we are in a common market, and if Italy falls into a very deep recession, the effects will be felt in the Netherlands and Germany.
Okay, so you asked many questions, so let's try to unpack them. First, on the political level, I thought it was morally repugnant to start immediately the you can say the blame game or the moral hazard story when you are hit by a crisis that is common to us all. No one in the Netherlands nor Italy has asked for the coronavirus, right? So we are all in this together. This is a disaster and that we have to weather, and I think we as Europeans should stand together in fighting this disaster. So I think to start immediately about, so this is an insurance, and I think this is insurance against a disaster, and I think stories about moral hazard and blame games are misplaced there from an economic point of view.
Yeah.
Of course, there is an issue, and that has to do with the economic fallout, the financial issues that might arise the moment Corona starts creating economic problems. And as I said, for the Italian case, there's not only the Corona or the healthcare crisis, there's also the economic crisis, problems in the public finances and in the financial system. So this is where Hoekstra is coming from. And basically we had these discussions many years during the Euro crisis. So basically starting from 2008 until, the last bailout packaging for Greece. For a many amount of years, it was impossible for the Netherlands or for Germany to stop their talking about fiscal discipline and structural reforms and to get their heads towards stabilizing the Eurozone financially, because that I think was needed. We needed to have all kinds of rescue mechanisms for governments and banks that had liquidity crisis and governments and banks that had solvency issues. And to a large extent, we didn't finish the business. Banking union is not finished. The rescue fund is not finished, in my view. But we did progress. We did make progress in instituting these kind of rescue schemes that were absent in the Eurozone before the crisis hit. So that was good. Now the discussion on Corona bonds. So factually, I think we have agreed to issue Corona bonds. So the 240 billion that has been freed up from the ESM, that is debt that's guaranteed by all the Eurozone member states, and that debt is used to fight the Corona crisis. So I would say this is just, you can say, relativity of fiscal language. This is for me Corona bonds. I think more can be done and perhaps should be done if needed. Then the question whether we should now go one step further and to make all debts in the Eurozone jointly and severally guaranteed by all Eurozone taxpayers, there I can see that the Netherlands and also Germany say, we're not going to let us be pushed into a discussion on something that's deeply fundamental to the Eurozone, you can say, architecture, that we are going to, so crisis fighting schemes and all these things standing together, I think there to start talks about moral hazard is inappropriate.
Yeah.
But when you're discussing really mutualization of all Eurozone debt, then this is a massive transfer of sovereignty, and this is a massive transfer of taxing powers. And then you need to think about the democratic the legitimacy of how you want to organize this. I think issuing joint government debt also at the Eurozone level also requires democratic institutions, truly democratic institutions at the Euro level. So a European Parliament which has taxing powers and these kind of things like normal parliaments have. And you also need to transfer sovereignty from member states to this, say, supranational power. And this requires both, you can say, from northern member states as southern member states, the willingness to transfer this sovereignty.
Yeah.
And here I'm having no illusions whatsoever that neither the north nor the southern countries want to transfer substantial amount of sovereignty to the European level, because the northern countries are afraid that they have to pay, the southern countries are afraid that they're being told what to do. And they have both, so you cannot say, well, we want to have money from Europe without being told what to do, and vice versa.
Exactly. So, and this brings me to my next question, and maybe we can transition a bit more into the political aspect of it, is the fact that, let's say well, there's two things. The first thing is that in the South, this is perceived as more austerity, and austerity is seen not to work. First, do you agree with this statement, first of all, or not?
I think the move to austerity in Europe was a big and grave mistake, although in some southern European countries it was necessary. So in Greece, it was impossible not to do austerity if you had a government deficit in the order, what was it, 12, 13% of GDP, and you lied about that in the order of 10% of GDP. So I think it was necessary. I think also in Spain and Portugal, and also to some extent in Italy, it was to some extent. But I think in Italy was always a bit of a different case because it had much less foreign debt problems than these other countries that I mentioned.
Yeah. The less foreign debt problem, it is less of a household debt problem.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know if you would call it a problem, but people seem to forget sometimes that when you look at total debt, in the Netherlands, private debt is twice as much as the debt in Italy. It's just held, different.
No, but I think for financial crisis, what the difference was is that the net foreign debt position was was a very good predictor of which countries went into trouble. And the Netherlands has a massive net asset position, so positive net assets, both actually also in the government side, but also in the private side. Yeah. And despite the fact that we have this shitload of mortgage debt.
Yeah, exactly. And for instance, so the Japanese case in which debt is 240% of GDP doesn't matter because half of it is owned by the Japanese central bank.
And the other half nearly by the Japanese private sector. And more than 90% of Japanese debt, of this more than 200% of GDP, is held by the Japanese themselves.
Yeah.
And the Japanese government can borrow at a 0% interest rate for I don't know how long. Yeah. So it's very important to understand who holds the debt.
Exactly, not just the total size, but the composition and who holds it, of course. With what you were saying about democratic European institution, it requires a certain amount of willingness to have more Europe. And this seems to be not the case in the North and not the case in the South, right? Let's say we don't do Eurobonds, populists are going to win in Italy. We do Eurobonds, to oversimplify things, populists are going to win in the North, right? And that seems to be maybe because there's a general lack of perceived or real benefit felt by the large amount of the population about being in the European Union and about being in the Eurozone in particular. Do you think that this is just a problem of perception, or do you think that because of increasing inequalities and other issues, the middle income families and the middle to low income families have really been left behind?
So I think there's a grain of truth and a grain of falsehood in the idea that Europe could benefit from Eurobonds. First of all, I think what most political parties and especially mainstream parties cannot explain, also because they play the blame game all the time, is that we gain massively from Europe. Most countries gain. There's mutual transactions like trade, like financial transactions that are mutually beneficial. The Netherlands can benefit from this massive export surplus because a large part of it is sold in the rest of Europe. So what we don't eat ourselves, we can sell abroad, and we make money by selling our produce abroad. Also, we make money, so we have a massive amount of saving in our pension funds, for example, and we invest that abroad, a large part in the Eurozone. We make money on it. Pensioners get their retirement income from these investments made abroad. So both our production and our saving relies on Europe to a large extent. And the same story applies to Southern Europe because, and again, Italy is a bit different than the others because it has this lower current account deficit. But still, it can borrow from other countries if it wants. Countries can borrow from the northern countries and to make investments in their own country. Especially, you think, this was the hope, of course, when the Eurozone started, that there would be a massive convergence and a boom in real investment, that the southern part of Europe would catch up with the northern part. And they could borrow the funds for these investments from the north. That would be mutual beneficial. Unfortunately, a large part of the investment went into the real estate stuff, and this wasn't really productive, as we've known. Second, also, you can import stuff that you cannot produce yourself. And also you can export stuff that the others cannot. So there's mutually beneficial transactions inside this free trade area, inside this capital market union, and that should benefit us all. And this story is not explained. Because politics is generally cast in zero-sum games. What we win, someone else loses. And this is how the populists frame their debates. That's also how Donald Trump frames the debate. Everything that is related to international affairs is zero-sum. Yeah. And this takes away. This is terrible for us as economists, because we have to tell the story about these mutual gains that are associated with being able to trade, but now there's the grain of truth. I think that the Eurozone didn't necessarily deliver the goodies, because trade is associated also with rising inequality. I mentioned these capital flows from north to south that generated a financial crisis in 2008 and a Eurozone crisis in 2010 that required massive bailouts of financial institutions, bailouts of countries, great financial havoc, enormous unemployment, depressions in some parts of Europe, recessions, deep recessions in other parts of Europe. And this was not how it was supposed to work, right? So the story about Europe as this engine for growth, prosperity, development, and so on, failed us at that moment. And there the populists have a point. Yeah. And I think we are still not strict enough on the financial system. We have too weakly capitalized banks. We don't have... So for me, the financial side of the Eurozone crisis has not been properly dealt with, even as of today. And that might flare up again when the corona crisis would become much worse than it is now. So that's something we didn't fix. The gains from trade, no one ever told you that they were equally distributed. So on average, countries gain, but when you look at the world, it's, for example, the Asian countries that gain from being able to trade with Europe and the US, because they are abundant in low-skilled labor, but our low-skilled workers lose from this.
Yeah.
And this is textbook economics. You can have aggregate gains from being able to trade, while some of your workers are actually losing.
Yeah.
And
but the idea was that you could redeploy those workers, but it's of course fantasy because it's not so easy.
The gains from trade have to be redistributed.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we saw the tax systems became less progressive. Top rates in the income tax system came down. Wealth taxes have been reduced. Inheritance taxes be reduced. Unemployment benefits have been, labor market have been less generous. Labor markets have become more flexible. So the push, you can say, in economic policy was definitely into, you can say, more liberal.
Yeah.
And I mean this in economic liberal direction. And so inequality has risen, job insecurity has risen, tax burdens has become more unequal. Companies are not paying as much tax as they used to. And then politicians in the mainstream, and we had this massive financial crisis, the burden was put on the shoulders of the ordinary people.
Yeah.
And then politicians are surprised that populists come to the political arena and make a fuss about this. I think they have a point there.
Absolutely. So it seems that even though, for very clear economic reason, the size of the pie has gotten larger for everyone, the distribution of it has not been fair or...
No, the size hasn't increased for everyone. It has increased on average, but not...
Yeah.
But we see in the basically entire Western world large increases in inequality, both before and after tax. We have seen rising skill premia, larger differentials between high and low skilled people. We see that not everyone gains from from world trade. We see also that there are issues with multinational companies having all kinds of trying to minimize their tax burdens via tax havens and stuff like that. So this is all happening at the same time. And this is where Europe could play a role. And I think this is where Europe doesn't step up sufficiently.
Yeah. So Europe seems to have stepped up, for instance, in big tech, in trying to, fight market power. But if something that Europe is not stepping up in is taxation, especially tax havens. In the sense, one of the recurring, and it might have been a bit of a populistic rhetoric, I agree, but one of the issues in Italy when Uxtra started to say, we shouldn't have this southern country, Italy said, well, maybe if these large corporations were not allowed to dodge taxes by being incorporated in the Netherlands, maybe we will have more tax income. Do you think there's any truth to this? Do you think there should be a minimum European tax rate? Do you think these big multinational corporations should in certain ways be taxed more?
I find these good questions, but I find them very hard to answer. And
even if you don't give us an answer, tell us why it's hard to answer this question.
It's hard to answer because I view the corporate tax as, you can say, the backstop to the personal tax. Because in the end, corporations don't pay tax, it's people that pay tax. I don't know whether you know the videos by Milton Friedman from his series Free to Choose. There's the one episode on the free lunch myth. And in the free lunch myth, he very eloquently explains that firms don't pay taxes, people pay taxes. So it's either the shareholder or the worker or the consumer of the products of the firm that ultimately pays the tax that is levied on the corporation. So I think we have, and this is the prime reason why we have corporate tax, is to tax the shareholder. And if we would be able to tax the shareholder directly, we might not be needing the corporate tax. Because this corporate tax is a tax on the dividends of the share paid out to the shareholder. And we do this at the corporation level rather than in the personal income tax of the shareholder. So, and there's good reasons for that. Because, for example, a company with tens of thousands of shareholders, it might be much more easy for governments to tax one company than 10,000 shareholders. Second, shareholders might be located everywhere on the planet, and you know where the company is. So it might be easier to tax the company. And it might be very difficult to trace down all the individual shareholders and tax them on their dividend incomes. So this is the complication with the corporate tax. Now, then you tax this not in the personal income tax, but at the corporation level. But then there is a lot of other things that are starting to happen. So corporations start moving their profits from high tax countries to low tax countries. Mm-hmm. The corporations start to invest less because the returns to their investments are getting taxed. Corporations are taking on more debt because debt is typically deductible for the corporation, but the dividends paid to the shareholders is not. So a lot of economic distortions and problems start appearing the moment you start taxing corporations instead of the shareholders. And now, this is why it's difficult to answer your question, should corporations pay more tax? Now, in an ideal world, I would say the shareholder should pay much more tax, because I think that in current tax systems, basically everywhere where I looked on the world, the tax rates on capital income are much lower than, certainly effectively, than tax rates on labor income. And they might need to be lower because it's more harder to tax them because of the higher mobility of capital. Mm-hmm. Maybe capital taxes are also more distortionary, so create more economic costs. So somewhat lower tax rate on capital might be defended, but still you see that capital income is very often very lightly taxed. So I think their problems need to be fixed in tax systems. Should you do it in the corporate tax system? I'm not so sure. And the reason, now get to all your questions about minimum tax or a common tax base in Europe, because suppose we introduce, that is the proposal by the EU, the common consolidated corporate tax base. So all companies have to consolidate all their profits, all the multinational companies have to consolidate all the profits from all their subsidiaries, no matter where they are located in Europe, and have one amount of profit that gets taxed, and then apportioned, allocated to different EU member states, and that can then levy their own tax on this part of the profit that's allocated via this apportionment factor to every individual member state. So this would remove any incentive to shift profits inside the EU. And because it's the total amount of profits that determines your total tax liability, and not the aggregate amount of profits that determine it, but not how they are distributed among countries. So you don't want to shift profits from high to low taxed countries via manipulation of transfer prices or constructions with royalties or internal debt shifting, moving debt to high tax countries because the interest costs on the debt are deductible, these kind of things. So companies might have no incentives anymore to shift profits with this common tax base. So you think, well, magic bullet. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately not, because the way you distribute the profits across countries then will trigger new behavioral responses, and that might be much worse than the profit shifting that we had before. So, for example, the key to allocate the profits across nations of European member states is based on how much the company sells in a country, how much of its capital assets are there, and how much of its workers are there. But now the company gets an incentive, for example, to move away workers from high-tax countries and put them in low-tax countries via outsourcing, or to move factories from high-tax countries to low-tax countries. So now the paper profit doesn't shift, no, also all the real activity starts shifting. So you are basically substituting paper profits for real shifting, and that is much more damaging because not only the profits will shift, but also your real activity. So your workers, your capital owners, maybe even your consumers will benefit less from the economic activity because the real activity now also moves. So you introduce a new problem with a common tax base. Moreover, with a common tax base, there's another problem, that is that it might become very beneficial to reroute your profits outside the EU, and then what have you solved? So it's no magic bullet. Yeah. Still, and then minimum tax rate, you can talk. I think that's also a very difficult discussion. Minimum tax rate, yes, I think that would in principle be desirable, but also might have some political difficulties because, for example, countries like Ireland might lose big time from introducing a minimum tax rate. So what do you do with that? since tax policy is to the, you can say, discretion of each individual member states, you require unanimity. So I think it would be a good policy, but I don't think it will be politically feasible.
Exactly. Yeah. You mentioned something before that triggered my attention. You think that banks are still not capitalized sufficiently.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah. Well, in the Euro crisis we had, so before the Euro crisis started, before the Great Recession started,
Yeah.
we seen leverage ratios of banks less than 2%. What does this mean? That for every euro banks lent out, they had less than 2 cents of equity and more than 98% of loans, borrowing, other stuff from other banks and so on, from the financial sector, also to fund this borrowing.
Yeah.
Anat Admati, who wrote together with Martin Helwig a book, The Banker's New Clothes, referred this metaphorically speaking as, well, we're driving around in a residential area, at a speed of 200 kilometers an hour. Normal corporations have leverage ratios that are 35 to 70% is very normal. Yeah. Somehow we came to think it's normal that we can have a stable banking system with minimal amounts of equity. And I think this is crazy, really crazy. And there were some discussions on raising capital requirements. So now we have the Basel Committee that sets the capital requirements, right? And so we now have a minimum capital requirement of, I guess, 4%.
Yeah.
And so going from 200 kilometers an hour in a residential area to 140 kilometers an hour is still, I think, massively dangerous.
It's actually even lower than 4%.
Yeah, and also I think it's 4% only on the dates when banks have to report to the authorities. So at all other days of the year, the effective leverage ratios are even lower. So I think that even if all banks comply with the standards we currently have, the standards are ridiculously weak. And most economists that have, so you know about finance. If I'm informed correctly, most economists in finance think that it should be at least something like 12.5% of equity. People like leverage ratios of people like Admati and Helwig even go to 25%. Yeah. So that's but I don't know many academic finance economists that think that 4% is right. And
well, it all depends, let's say, on the riskiness of the asset. That's why we have risk-weighted assets, and the other capital measure that we use is common equity to risk-weighted assets, in which you don't count all these assets as the same. If I'm a bank that only invests in real estate, of course, I'm not as risky as an investment bank, right? So the leverage ratio then applying the same leverage ratio doesn't really matter. That's why we have CET1 to other
but I think there was a big problem with banks determining the risk weights in their own risk models, and this was very difficult to verify for supervisors, right?
That's exactly my job, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. Yes. And we're trying to get better and better at it. Unfortunately, these are econometrics model in which, you haven't done much empirical research, you said, but I've done a lot, and I know that the outcome of your model can vary significantly.
But I think maybe it's so. I think this discussion is for non-experts extremely difficult.
Exactly. So we should.
But I think we can give the main. So what I think is strange that banks aim for the minimum. So if the supervisor says the minimum, they all are at the minimum, but they are never above. So, and for me as a welfare economist, for me it is clearly the case that having high leverage creates negative externalities to societies. So banks will say, well, the cost of debt is much higher than the cost of equity is much higher than the cost of debt. So we want to have more debt. But at the social level, the cost of debt is clearly not higher lower than the cost of equity. So because of the chance of financial crisis, because of interest deductibility, it's logical that private actors say, well, this cost is much lower to me because it's deductible. But at the social level, we lose revenue that you need to factor in. You need to factor in that we save banks when they're systemic and too big to fail. So that's an implicit subsidy from the taxpayer to the banks, and this implicit subsidy gets higher if they have more debt. So these things call for there are negative externalities associated with that, not positive. And if anything, we should give a deduction for equity rather than.
One of the first moves of the ECB and the EBA was to tell banks, these additional capital requirements that we usually ask, don't worry, they're not binding. Yeah. This was decided within a week, and the interesting thing about it is that because the idea was if we lower the requirements, banks can lend more and they can help firms during this crisis get through it because they don't have. So a capital requirement, let's say, restricts the amount of loans that the bank can disburse.
But basically they fall in the trap of the lie that banks keep on telling the whole world, including the financial supervisors, that the capital requirement is constraining their lending activity. Mm-hmm. No, it's not. You can issue more equity if you want to have more lending.
Sure.
I don't know why this always has to be financed by debt.
Well, because if you issue more equity, you decrease your equity and the return on equity of your shareholders, which in the end, are the ones that call the shots goes down.
No,
right?
but I can see why they want it.
Yeah.
But that's a different question than why they cannot do it. Mm. So they can. Absolutely. They can expand lending by issuing more equity, but they just don't want it because debt is subsidized by the taxpayer and equity isn't.
Yeah.
And the subsidy ends in the pocket of the equity holder, the shareholder.
However, if we increase, unless we force them to issue more equity, I can see in a country like the Netherlands, if we do decide to increase capital requirements on banks and banks stop issuing mortgages to the rate that they do, this could become politically very unfeasible. I mean,
but I find it very strange that if you look at the balance sheet total of the Eurozone or the European total, I'm not sure. This is something like in the order of 10,000 billion euro, right? Something like
the total.
I think it's and
I don't know the number actually.
Okay, maybe I'm making a mistake here. My apologies. I need to check it out. But banks can apparently fund their balance sheet with a massive amount of money in debt, but then they start screaming hell when a tiny bit of that needs to be funded by equity, right? So we can fund thousands and thousands of billions of debt, of bank loans with debt, but only a tiny fraction more with equity. That's impossible. I don't buy that story. And also, when crisis when shit would hit the fan in the Eurozone, I hope not, but then I think for debt equity conversions would help and things like bail-in would help to make banks more stable.
Yeah, I mean, the bail-in, it's an interesting thing, and maybe we can close with it. The bail-in is the idea that if the bank gets into trouble, some of the people that lend the money to the bank, the least senior debt holders will, incur some of these costs. And, from an economic point of view, it makes complete sense, but then it illustrates one of these demographic and market differences between countries. In Italy, most of these non-senior debt, this risky debt that should bear the cost of a bank falling down, is held by pensioners. Is held by people that shouldn't have lent, no one should have sold them these instruments, right? But I remember when the Euro crisis was happening, and I was in Italy, and I asked my grandma, I was like, Grandma, can you please show me, where your money is? Yeah. All over savings was subordinated debt from a single bank sold to her by an advisor from that bank, right? So then a measure like bail-in, which makes complete sense economically, right? And I agree with this. The investor that take more risk should bear the cost of the risk. Once you translate it to the demographic of it and who actually holds this, then in Italy became politically unfeasible.
Yeah, same with Monte dei Paschi di
Monte
Siena.
Paschi di Siena, exactly.
That was the same story.
Yeah.
Bail-in didn't work because there were too many large depositors that didn't know that they had subordinate debt at the bank.
So I think this illustrates the challenge and the challenges for a party like Volt when we're trying to, define, an economic policy that will work for all of Europe. That there are so many differences between countries, and so challenging condition that it's very hard to come up with something that is comprehensive. So if you would have one advice to give us or something that we should be particularly careful about, it would be appreciated if you have any.
No, but your last example shows why we need Europe or why we don't need Europe. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we cannot organize on the national level, at the member state level. Things that have to do with carbon pricing, for example. I think that most economists are in favor of having a CO2 tax on all emissions. But individual countries have difficulties implementing it, if not all other countries are doing it, because then firms will remove their production activities. So climate, taxation is something that we need to do at the European level. Migration policy is something we need to do at the European level. Maybe even security policy we need to do at the European level. So there is a couple of things that member states cannot do on their own. And there we need to have good European institutions, good European policies, and good European politicians. However, there are some things that you can organize at the member state level. So I think it should be there. So this subsidiarity, things that you can organize at the local level, organizing it at that local level. Yeah. And I think this is the only way also you can build support, because otherwise Europe becomes a sausage factory. Everyone gets the same. And there cannot be, so the only way to deal with this heterogeneity that you just mentioned is that when you have things like public services or unemployment insurance or pension systems or all these things that can be organized at the member state level, leave it there. Things that you cannot do, also financial regulation, banks and stuff like that, all these things that cross borders, you need to do at the European level. And I think it's a bit of a sorry tale that we've seen Europe discussing so much things so take an example, the budgetary rules. Yeah. I think they're dividing Europe rather than uniting Europe. Mm-hmm. I think the budgetary rules are arbitrary, are not capable of dealing with the most simple economic issues, like they only look at the debt side but not at the asset side of liabilities. They look at deficits in 1 year and don't look at the longer term sustainability of public finances. And moreover, they create a central force in Europe towards austerity, and they stop governments from thinking how we should look at government investment, how we should look at debt as a tool to support the economy rather than a goal in and of itself. And so here I think that the budgetary rules really have to be rewritten, and even I would, but this is a radical proposal, I would rather abolish them, but this requires banking union to be fully operational. Because if you abolish budgetary rules, and governments can go bankrupt, can fail, can restructure their debts, then this should be possible without sending shockwaves to the European financial system. Yeah. And this can only be accommodated if we have a good and strong banking union, so that banks can endure with sufficient funds, recapitalizations, restructurings, can accommodate government that will default. If that is not possible, this is the only reason I see budgetary rules, because of this interaction between banks and governments. So I think there we need to break the deadly embrace. Yeah. And if we have broken the deadly embrace between banks and governments, we can drop the budgetary rules. And that would put budgetary sovereignty where it should be, namely at the national level.
That's a very interesting point. Thank you very much for
your
time.
You're welcome.
It's been very fun to talk to you, and hopefully
Same here.
we'll talk to you more in the future.
Okay, good luck. Good luck
Thanks.
with your party.
Thank you.
Bye.